Webinar started.
Okay, I think we're ready to go here. Good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that this is our last event for the spring, except for our annual in-person conference this very next weekend on May 20th. That conference is jointly sponsored with Biography International Organization, a dues-paying gathering of some 600 working and aspiring biographers. It is going to be a terrific conference with some 20 different panels focused on the art and craft of biography. It is not too late to register for this conference. Just go to the BIO's webpage. And if you have not done so already, please register your email address on our website so that you can be notified of our future events. And for any working biographers out there, I just want to remind you that the application process is open for applying for one of our 5 biography fellowships, each worth $72,000. And the deadline is January 4th, but you can begin to think about that now. But tonight we are here to discuss Professor Chad Williams' new biography of W.E.B. Du Bois. He will be in conversation with Professor David Levering Lewis. Chad Williams is the Samuel J. and Augusta Spector Professor of History and African American Studies at Brandeis University. He earned a BA in History and African American Studies from UCLA, and both his MA and PhD in History from Princeton University. He is the author of the award-winning book, Torchbearers of Democracy, African American Soldiers in the World War I Era, and The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois, and the First World War, which has just been published by Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. David Levering Lewis is the author of 9 books, including W.E.B. Du Bois' Biography of a Race, 1868 to 1919, and The Fight for Equality and the American Century, also about the second volume of Du Bois, covering his life from 1919 to 1963. Each Du Bois volume received the Pulitzer Prize for Biography and in different years. And the first Du Bois volume was also awarded the Bancroft Prize and the Francis Parkman Prize. Lewis is also the author of God's Crucible, Islam and the Making of Europe, 570 to 1215. That book has been translated into Spanish, Portuguese, Croatian, Korean, and Indonesian. His last book, The Improbable Wendell Willkie, the businessman who saved the Republican Party and his country and conceived a new world order, was published in 2018. His next book is A Family History as the American Story, 1785 to 1960, and it is forthcoming from Penguin Random House in 2024. David will steer the conversation for about 45 minutes, and then he'll take questions from our virtual audience on Zoom. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. David, I now turn the rest of this evening's event over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kai. Oops.
No, I just.
Chad.
Yes.
Is a superb biography.
Oh,
and I
thank you.
want to start our conversation by quoting myself because I sometimes truly believe what I say. I sent these words to be used by your publisher. And I said, until Chad Williams's heroic accumulation of sources, this stunning mastery, his stunning mastery of them, and his uncanny reckoning with his subject's ego,
Mm.
W.E.B. Du Bois's unfinished history of the Great War remained a mystery. We can now write QED to Professor Williams's brilliant The Wounded World.
Mm.
And I want to say more about your analytical comfort with one of the great intellects of the last 2 centuries, as I marveled at your laser-like determination to carry your protagonist from hope to disillusion to failure. I sought an explanation, and then I found it. Endnote 43 on page 434.
Hmm.
You thank a colleague for encouraging you to use the term strategic dishonesty in characterizing Du Bois's behavior.
Hmm.
Please explain.
Wow. Well, first, let me say thank you for being in conversation with me this evening, David. Thank you for all of your support going all the way back to graduate school. I mean, you played such an important role in my sense of vocation as a historian, my professional development, and obviously your work on Du Bois is the touchstone for so much of us, and especially me. So I'm incredibly grateful for all of your contributions, your scholarship, your commitment to African American history throughout your distinguished career. And thank you for the incredibly generous words about my book. Du Bois, as you know, is a difficult individual to get a handle on. And as far as my comfort level, that took some time to build the confidence, quite frankly, to tackle Du Bois, but to also understand his complexities, to understand his motivations, to understand his ego, as you just mentioned. And I had to think about the ways in which he made particular choices throughout his life and the problematic nature of some of those choices, particularly as it related to the First World War, the topic of my book. I was presenting my work at Vanderbilt University and was in conversation with Tiffany Patterson, a colleague and friend, and she encouraged me to think about Du Bois kind of in relation to this idea of strategic dishonesty. And there are times where I was going through Du Bois's papers, going through his writings, and we become so frustrated with him because I knew he wasn't telling the truth. I knew he wasn't being completely honest with himself, with his readers, and I had to understand, what was going on there. What was the logic that he was employing in making certain choices throughout his career, and especially the very difficult choices, the very problematic choices that he made in supporting World War I. And those were choices that he ultimately had to reckon with, really throughout the duration of his life and career.
Yes, and so on this point of a difficult choice to make with regard to the Great War, you would not have thought that he would have written Close Ranks if you had been attending an NAACP board meeting, say, 2 or 3 months earlier. The board members were, for the most part, pacifists. Many of them believed that this was a war that did not immediately beckon our participation. Certainly, many African Americans regarded this as a civil war amongst white people in a different continent.
Yeah.
And yet, Du Bois ends up writing one of the most electric and and mobilizing editorials in the crisis
Mhm.
of his brilliant career.
Yep.
Close ranks, and I should be able to quote it from memory, but in fact, I
Right, we
no
both
longer
should at
can.
this point. Yeah.
However, how did he come to do this? Because the community, the African American community, was sundered by his decision to
Mm.
say that we must, as it were, park our concerns for the duration of this bloodletting.
Yeah, yeah.
That these things we will address later, but
Set
now,
aside our special grievances is what he said.
yes,
Set
indeed.
aside our special grievances. Yeah.
All right. And so Francis Archibald Grimke at the NAACP branch in Washington was prepared to secede from the organization.
Yeah.
And many of the Niagarites, that is, the people who had joined Du Bois in the days when his kind of civil rights was most unpopular because of
Mhm.
the imperium of Booker T. Washington.
Mhm.
They too were disconsolate and shocked.
To put it lightly, yeah.
Not to mention, of course, the radicals, you might say, A. Philip Randolph and
Yep.
others who thought that this was a most terrible thing to have done.
Mhm.
How does he get there? And when I ask that, I would ask it in this way: how does Joel Spingarn, the
Mm.
chairman of the NAACP board, influence this man so that he reaches this point where he
Yeah.
risks disuniting so many of his followers and associates?
Oh, wow. It's such a multi-layered question. And I encourage everyone to read the book. I do my best to delve into the entirety of the closed ranks controversy. But I think in some ways we have to take a step back and think about what were Du Bois's motivations for even supporting the war in the first place. I mean, obviously he writes the African roots of war. He's identifying the origins of the war in that brilliant, prescient article in the Atlantic Monthly, in the imperial competition over Africa and its human and material resources, essentially leading to a European civil war. He still considers himself, at least in theory, a pacifist, but he's also enamored with the democratic possibilities of the war and its ability to transform the social and political and economic status of Black people, both in the United States and throughout the entire African diaspora. In this way, I think he's hearkening back to a tradition of African-American support for war, African-American military service in particular, as an engine of democratic change, right? Thinking of someone like Frederick Douglass, who encouraged Black people to wear the uniform of the Union Army. Thinking about the ways in which war and patriotic service could indeed transform the citizenship status and democratic future of Black people. So he was willing to make that bargain, right? He was willing to take that risk in thinking about what this war can mean on a larger global scale. And he admits to being swept up into the hyper-patriotism of the war. Right? He writes, I believe in Dusk of Dawn in 1940, that he felt closer to feeling a true American than at any other time in his life or since. So I think there's something about the hyper-nationalism of the war that encapsulates Du Bois, that fuels his hope, as I write about in the book. And Joel Spingarn is a very important part of that. Joel Spingarn being arguably his closest friend in the NAACP, someone who firmly believed in the possibility of 100% Americanism, right? Of kind of eschewing the hyphenated identity that he as a Jewish American had, and really feeling 100% American in terms of his patriotism and willingness to serve in the military itself. So when Joel Spingern approaches Du Bois with this opportunity, as you know, to serve as a captain in the Military Intelligence Bureau, Du Bois is torn, and he feels this sense of personal obligation to Joel Spingern to say yes. He feels a sense of patriotic duty to serve his country. He's also feeling the pressures from the Sedition Act, from the federal government, starting to clamp down on the crisis. So he sees, I think, in the end, close ranks as an opportunity to make his position on the war clear, but to also, he hoped, calm the waters as it related to the persecution that he could potentially be facing by the federal government, as well as calming the waters within the War Department to secure this very controversial captaincy that he applied for. And it all falls apart in spectacular fashion. The uproar surrounding closed ranks and Du Bois's capitulation, as many saw it, was furious. William Monroe Trotter, his one-time ally in the Niagara movement, labels him a rank quitter in the fight for rights. He's accused of being a traitor to the race, even worse than Booker T. Washington. And that was quite stunning for Du Bois. And as I argue in the book, for someone who dedicated his life to the service, to the uplift of the race, to be called a traitor was something that I think struck him to his core. And he had to reckon with that, certainly in the immediate aftermath of the war. But as I talk about in the book, throughout the entirety of the interwar period and even after, I think that criticism that came along with closed ranks was really one of the most defining moments of his life and his career.
So he makes this decision, and I gather, since your second part of your biography is entitled Disillusion, he is disillusioned because he was wrong in the anticipation of the consequences, that integration by way of gore on the battlefield would give citizenship to African Americans. This doesn't happen. And so he's in trouble, isn't he? How's he going to get out of this dilemma? Is it true to believe what I seem to recall Joel Spingern himself writing a note to his wife, Amy, saying, Du Bois, I've gotten Du Bois into a patch of trouble and difficulty, and the board is sending him abroad so that when he comes back, you'll sing a different tune. I'm outlarizing what is actually said, but that's the idea.
Yeah. Well, I think in true Du Bois fashion, the way that he envisioned getting out of trouble was writing a book. He believed that he could write his way out of the complications that arose as a result of closed ranks. And when he's tasked by the NAACP board, as I write about in the book, in October of 1918, of writing a historical account of the Black experience in the war, he immediately leaps at the opportunity. He views it as an opportunity for vindication, right? Of demonstrating that his decision to support the war, his decision to encourage Black people to close ranks, to give their lives for their country on the battlefield, was ultimately the right decision, right? And he really commits himself to writing this history and views it as a way to set the record straight, and in the process, reestablish his leadership credibility, the credibility that was lost as a result of the closed ranks controversy. So when he goes to France in December of 1918, very controversially, just how he gets to France is another fascinating story that I talk about in the book. he's hoping to find vindication for the decisions that he made in supporting the war. And instead, he's faced with the reality, right, of the brutality of the war and the really horrific nature of American white supremacy as it had been transported to France and inflicted upon Black servicemen and particularly officers. So it's really when he goes to France, those remarkable 3 months where he's organizing a Pan-African Congress, where he's touring the battlefields, where he's in the trenches, he's seeing the destruction at Verdun and other places. He begins to realize that this war was much more horrific than he could have even possibly imagined. And he has to reckon with that. And the way that he tries to reckon with the weight of that disillusionment is through the writing of history.
So maybe you could tell us a bit more about how he comes to convene a Pan-African Congress in, as it were, in the shadow of Woodrow Wilson's operation. It shouldn't have happened. Why on earth would Du Bois be permitted to arrange for a conference that would, I assume, be critical of the European imperium in Africa? How did that come to pass?
Right. So as you know, Du Bois had a longstanding interest in Pan-Africanism. He was the secretary, I believe, at the 1900 Pan-African Congress in London, organized by Henry Sylvester Williams. So this was something that was always on his mind. And even before the war came to an end, he was thinking about what the defeat of Germany would potentially mean for the African continent and the future of Germany's African colonies. And he saw the opportunity to go to France and potentially organize a Pan-African Congress as a way to essentially lobby the European powers who were assembling at Versailles and make a case that Germany's former colonies needed to be essentially taken care of, in some type of, whether it was a mandate, what would eventually become the League of Nations, kind of laying the groundwork for their eventual self-determination and even possible independence. But the Pan-African Congress in February of 1919 would not have happened without the assistance of Blaise Diagne, the Senegalese deputy to the French Parliament, who Du Bois met when he arrived in France in December of 1918. He was really the one who was instrumental in allowing for that Congress to take place, of convincing Clemenceau that the Congress would not in any way embarrass France, that it was not going to be a radical call for independence and critique of the French mission civilisatrice, right? This was, essentially, a good opportunity for France to have additional leverage when it came to the peace conference. So Du Bois, in some ways, he had to be very strategic in navigating the terrain in Paris at this time, and he recognized that aligning himself with Blaise Diagne would be to his ultimate benefit in organizing the Pan-African Congress. And this, of course, meant that many of the radical demands that Du Bois may have wanted to put forth during the Pan-African Congress had to be muted as a result of Blaise Diagne's role in organizing it.
So Monsieur Diagne then had sacrificed his own people for the benefit of French glory.
He did, yeah.
Hundreds of thousands of Senegalese were present at the Marne and made quite a difference.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, then he was highly esteemed and privileged in the French political universe.
Mm-hmm.
So he had done what Du Bois thought would happen if our people acquitted themselves well.
Mhm.
They did do so, did they not? Just to see how complicated this scene on the French continent, the French nation was. There were exemplary performances by African-American soldiers, I believe.
Mhm. Absolutely, yeah. So you have two Black combat divisions who fought on the front lines. The 93rd Division was made up primarily of Black National Guardsmen. They actually served with the French military. And so we have the famous 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, who served for 191 consecutive days on the front lines. So yeah, so you have some really remarkable contributions and heroics on the part of Black soldiers. The 92nd Division, which was made up primarily of African-American draftees, also contained African-American officers, which was key. As you know, Du Bois advocated for the creation of a segregated officers training camp in Fort Des Moines, Iowa. And he saw many of those men kind of as the fighting arm of his talented 10th. They were going to be the ones who would lead the race into the future through their heroic service and leadership in the American Expeditionary Forces. The 92nd Division had a very challenging experience, to put it lightly. They were maligned by the American High Command. They were accused of being cowards on the battlefield, were accused of being rapists, really just a horrific example of the ways in which American racism and white supremacy was transported from the United States and then institutionalized in France, and how that affected the experiences of Black soldiers in the 92nd Division. And when Du Bois talks to these men, he hears their stories. It really affects him, I think, on a deeply personal level. So he's torn between wanting to valorize Black soldiers for their contributions in the war, their heroism, their bravery, while at the same time exposing really the horrific racism and white supremacy of the American army, right? So this is really where his idealism, his hope, begins to clash with his growing disillusionment.
Well, then we need a book that explains why democracy will not be won on the battlefield because of the deeply ingrained status quo white supremacy of the South, whose influence in the American military establishment is disproportionately large.
Yes.
What kind of book then is he going to write? Because we have, it seems, some competing narratives of the war. We have an interesting man who has been appointed by the Secretary of the Army, Newton Baker, to represent the African-American need in his department, who writes, indeed, an official history of the Great War and African-American participation in it. And it's perhaps a fairly good account, narrative.
In some ways, yeah. Yeah. So I get into all this, and it's really just an incredibly fascinating story. And as I was doing research, just kind of peeling back the different layers of Du Bois's attempts to write this history, it became more and more fascinating, more complex, more entertaining even. So he initially envisions co-authoring his book with Carter G. Woodson, the founder of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the founder of Negro History Week, which is now Black History Month, the second African-American to receive his PhD in history from Harvard after Du Bois. So envisions Carter G. Woodson as one of his co-authors, And his other co-author, the individual that you mentioned, Emmett J. Scott, who was Booker T. Washington's former secretary at the Tuskegee Institute, who was appointed by Newton Baker as a special assistant when it came to Negro affairs related to the war. Emmett Scott had plans to write his own book. So this immediately clashed with Du Bois's ambitions. Here was someone who had incredible power, leverage within the War Department, national influence, a national platform, who was going to really, who's going to be the competition for Du Bois's book. And Du Bois, had to figure out how to undercut as best as he could Emmett Scott's book, but also how to use his relationship with Scott to his advantage. So they engage in a, at times very dramatic, at times very ugly back and forth surrounding their competing histories of the war. Emmett Scott ultimately publishes his book, which is very highly regarded at the time and serves kind of as
by General Pershing, perhaps.
It was endorsed by Pershing. I think Theodore Roosevelt gave an endorsement of it before he passed away. So it was, it was a big deal. And Du Bois was very much aware of that book and the need to challenge what Emmett Scott wrote in his book as it related to the kind of sanitizing the experiences that Black soldiers had to face in the war. Du Bois was adamant that Emmett J. Scott, first of all, didn't possess the academic credentials as he did to write a scholarly, scientific, historically accurate book. And secondly, his proximity to the War Department undercut his credibility to be honest about the racism that existed in the military during the war.
The attack on Emmett Scott reminded me of Senator Howard Baker during the impeachment of Richard Nixon, who famously said, you remember, what did the president know and when did he know it? And
Exactly.
about it. And poor Emmett Scott was challenged with unpardonable malperformances and malfeasance.
Exactly.
And yet it was a fairly responsible narrative, was it?
For the most part. I mean, it was very celebratory in many ways, but it was very thorough and very comprehensive. And I think Du Bois's main critique of it was the lack of kind of critical perspective that it contained, as it related to the broader conditions that African Americans were facing during the war, and specifically the ingrained nature of American white supremacy. Right? I mean, Du Bois, viewed the war, as fundamentally about the future of the color line, right? And that's something that Emmett Scott, in his celebratory account of the war, certainly elided.
So then, what kind of book did Du Bois begin to write? Was it, you mentioned, I think, his prescient essay in the Atlantic Monthly in 1915, The African Roots of the War. It was an extraordinarily learned and globalist appreciation of the importance of the war and its racial valences. Was that going to be the line that Du Bois would follow?
Yeah, so Du Bois had incredibly grand ambitions for the history that he wanted to write. He initially titled it The Black Man in the Revolution of the 20th Century.
Mhm.
So he began writing his book with the idea that the war was this revolutionary, transformative moment, really in the history of the world and possibly in the history of the 20th century. He's envisioning it on a global scale. He's envisioning writing chapters on the impact of the war on the totality of the African diaspora, what it portended for the future of Pan-Africanism. He starts drafting chapters on the experiences of African colonial troops in the French army, as you mentioned before. He's drafting a chapter on West Indian troops who served in the British military. So he's thinking about a diasporic history, right? And the ways in which the war was fundamentally connected to the status and future of Africa and the broader diaspora. But he's also really focused on what the war then also means for African Americans, right? And beginning to grapple with these very difficult questions that he had to face during the war about why African Americans chose to support the war, the challenge that they faced, the challenge that he himself faced in making the decision to support the war. So the early version of the book that he's initially drafting in 1920, 1921 is kind of global in scale. It's still holding out a sense of hope, a sense of possibility for the war as having some type of redemptive meaning and value. That begins to change as the interwar period goes on, as Du Bois's disillusionment with the war continues to deepen. And by the mid-1920s, when he changes the title of his book to The Black Man and the Wounded World, this incredibly evocative title, right? He's now viewing the war as a tragedy, right? As one of the most kind of horrific moments in modern world history. He writes in one of his chapter drafts that the war was a scourge, an evil, a retrogression to barbarism, a waste, a wholesale murder, right? So the way that his views evolve, from his initial writings of the book in early 1920, by the mid 1920s, much more hardened, much more disillusioned.
Did the writing of, because there hadn't been anything in the way of a book since, well, I think you would say since The Souls of Black Folk. And so the next book is going to be an extraordinary book, Dark Water, in which Du Bois, it seems, denounces European civilization as it were inherently barbarous, that white supremacy can really not be modified or mitigated.
Yeah, I think he says that Dark Water was written in tears and blood, or something to that
Yes.
effect. Yeah.
And the intensity of the denunciations really was startling to reviewers abroad as well as in the United States.
Yeah.
And yet, looking at it from, say, today, the indictment of white supremacy as a kind of genetic spore may have some resonance as we look at our critical evaluation of American exceptionalism, mission civilisatrice of the French, and so on. I don't mean to say that perhaps one would credit what he has to say without qualification.
Right.
Yet he is sounding a criticism that had not been in the throats of most writers of the time.
Yeah.
And certainly he is exceptional as an African American in his venomous criticism of European civilization.
Yeah, I mean, Dark Water is an incredible book, and on the occasion of its 100th anniversary in 2020, when it felt like our democracy was in tatters, I made the case, for Dark Water being the book of that moment, and the arguments that Du Bois was making in that book were so relevant to the moment that we were living in 2020, and the moment that we're still living in today, quite frankly. But as I argue in my book, that writing Dark Water comes directly out of his anger and frustration, and anguish about the war, right? The impact of World War I is so infused throughout Dark Water, and the fact that he finishes writing Dark Water in the context of the Red Summer of 1919, where he's grappling with having just come back from France, seeing firsthand the devastation of the war, hearing about the racism in the United States Army, and then coming back to the United States to race riots and Black soldiers being attacked and lynched, some still wearing their uniforms, Chicago, Washington, D.C., Arkansas, just this horrific moment. And Du Bois, I think, channels his frustrations, his hopes, his wounds, but also capturing, I think, kind of the zeitgeist of Black America, in that book as only he could. But he asked, I think, a remarkable question in Dark Water, and I'm quoting him here. He says, "How great a failure, and a failure in what, does the World War betoken?" And it's just a remarkable question that he's asking in 1919, 1920, right? Already thinking about the war as a failure. And as I argue in my book, that's a question that he feels a need to answer, right? And the way that he's going to go about answering that is through the writing of his own book.
You use the word zeitgeist, and there were two zeitgeists. There was Du Bois's denunciatory sense of speaking for people of color globally, and there was at the same time the zeitgeist of Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. You might say a few words about that kind of literature, because these were American thinkers assessing the ways in which civilization was being stressed, as I recall.
Yeah. So I think he engages in a quite famous and dramatic debate with Lothrop Stoddard, I believe, right? And I think he comes out the victor in that debate. So Du Bois is
Lothrop Stoddard's book was
Rising Tide of White Supremacy. Was that the title of it?
Something like that.
Rising Tide of Color, right? Mm-hmm. So you have different white supremacist intellectuals who are concerned about what the aftermath of the war is going to mean, in terms of the future of white supremacy, the future of colonialism in an empire, this sense that the war has stirred the ambitions of people of color, which indeed it had, right? And I think Du Bois is very much aware of that, and is writing about the ways in which the war has transformed Black America, has transformed the African diaspora, and viewing it, right, as a turning point, right, in the broader struggle for Black freedom and democracy on a global scale. So part of his ambitions in writing his book, I believe, is to not only kind of assert, himself, and to kind of provide a sense of historical vindication, but to also, write a different type of history, set a different type of historical narrative than the ones that are being written at the time.
So then we need this book. Why? What is the
We
problem?
needed the book. Oh my God. I mean, it's really one of the, as you said, one of the great mysteries of Du Bois's life, why he wasn't able to finish what would have been one of his most, I think, impressive, ambitious works of history, a book that he ultimately worked on for 2 decades, from one World War to the next, drafted 800 pages, collected mountains of primary source documents. I think as the book evolved over the years, it became a different type of book. By the mid to late 1930s, it became a book about the lessons, a warning call, if you will, about the horrors of modern warfare, the dangers of World War as World War II is on the horizon. I believe it would have been, without question, the definitive history of the Black experience in the war. And I think really reshaped how we view Du Bois as a historian, as an intellectual, how we view him as an activist, if he had completed this book, which he ultimately didn't. And I believe the reasons why he wasn't able to complete it was the topic itself. The subject of the war itself was so massive, so disillusioning, such a failure, that he wasn't able to make sense of it, both on a personal level, but also on a historical level.
So that is interesting, because he did have the opportunity, the funds to write the book.
He did.
And so,
Yeah.
What do we make of that? He said, if I can just have, he said, $6,000 in high depression, I can work. Indeed, he gets it. The Rosenwald Fund provides the money.
Yeah, 1931. Yeah.
Yes, but we don't have the book. What happened?
But we don't have the book. But we have another book, though. We have Black Reconstruction, right? So, and I credit you. I mean, really encouraged me to think about Du Bois's relationship to white philanthropy, and the fact that he does have this opportunity, this moment, to devote uninterrupted time to completing the book. He chooses not to. This is, again, one of those choices, right, that he makes. He chooses to instead start working on Black Reconstruction, another massive book, another book which I am extremely grateful that he finished, because we all benefited from Black Reconstruction. But I had to ask myself, why is he able to finish Black Reconstruction in all of its enormity, all the challenges that came along with writing that book, but he's not able to finish his other book on the history of the First World War? In some ways, Black Reconstruction was an easier book for Du Bois to write. He didn't have the same type of personal attachment that he had to the history of the Great War. Reconstruction was, at least in his mind, history, whereas the World War was the present. Its legacy was still ongoing. It was still evolving. And that's, I think, ultimately the reason why he was able to finish Black Reconstruction, which, at one point he saw as, kind of the first of, 2 books chronicling the history of democracy for Black people in the 19th and 20th century, his book on Reconstruction and his book on the Great War. Obviously, his book on the Great War is never completed.
I think we should have some questions.
Yes, absolutely.
However, before we do, I would just like to mention another project, and that was the Encyclopedia of the Negro.
Yeah.
And there, Du Bois stood ready to raise the money by way of the General Education Board and the Carnegie Fund to write to compose and as its editor, the Encyclopedia of the Negro.
Right.
And I think perhaps And that was a reason why, instead of a second volume being the Great War, his energies were diverted to another splendid opportunity, which we would have
Yeah.
been, of course, quite grateful for if he had achieved that. That did not happen. But
Yeah.
what we did have was the Myrdal Carnegie funded
American Dilemma. Yeah.
American Dilemma, which was supposed to have been Du Bois's
Yep.
$200,000, but did not
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and,
And certainly, and I think just briefly, there were a lot of practical considerations that went into his inability to not complete the book. He was perpetually busy. He was always engaged in the next project, whether it was The Gift of Black Folk, writing Dark Princess, the Encyclopedia of the Negro, as you said. But I think in the end, there were choices Du Bois has made that could have led to different results. And ultimately, I think his inability to finish the book spoke more to Du Bois's inability to make sense of the war itself than those other kind of practical considerations and challenges that he faced.
Yeah. Well, there are a number of questions, and I'll take this one. What a bounty of genius, the three of, oh dear me. Thank you. My question relates to the difficulty of grasping Du Bois. Was he less graspable because we think we know who and what he was? Aren't all very prominent people subject for expectations that they remain true to, subject to our expectations, that they remain true to what we need from them? But nobody can remain steadfast in the face of changing circumstances. Well, I suppose yes.
Well, I definitely feel like I'm back in graduate school now. Thank you so much, Professor Painter, my dear mentor and advisor. Du Bois is, really one of the monumental figures in American history. And I think the seduction, of hagiography. I mean, since we're talking about biography, I mean, there's I think a temptation to want to write about him in a way that extols, his genius, all of his amazing contributions, but at the same time, we have to recognize their humanity, recognize Du Bois's humanity, and that was really one of the biggest challenges, but one of the most exciting aspects of writing this book, to think about Du Bois as a human being who had faults, who had frailties, someone who was even capable of failure, right? As I title the third part of my book, what did it mean to think about Du Bois in relation to failure, but also to think of failure not as a flaw, right? As some type of stain on his legacy, on his identity, but the ways in which he used failure to grow, to become even more committed to the cause of Black freedom, to become a peace activist, right? How do we make sense of Du Bois evolving from 1918 and encouraging Black people to close ranks to, by 1951, the federal government is ready to put him in jail for his anti-war activities, right? I think we have to really reckon with the ways in which Du Bois used the failure of World War I and ultimately the failure to not complete his book, right, to become an even more radical activist and fighter for Black freedom and a fighter for peace.
I will share this question, perhaps since it's very brief. Were there many other instances of Du Bois being critiqued from the left?
Oh, certainly. I mean, Du Bois was was always being critiqued. And Dave, I'm sure you can speak to that. I mean, certainly during the war, when he really kind of puts aside his pacifist principles, where he goes against many of his socialist colleagues, many of whom were on the NAACP board in supporting the war. By the end of the war, I mean, he is not seen as the once radical Du Bois that he was before the war. And those criticisms stayed with him, throughout the interwar period. His feud with Marcus Garvey and other Black radicals at the time. So certainly Du Bois and his relationship to the Communist Party, certainly during the 1920s, much different than it is by the 1940s and 1950s, right? So certainly his relationship to the left was severely compromised as a result of his stance during World War I. And it takes really the entirety of the interwar period, and even in the aftermath of World War II, for him to be aligned with the left in the way that we tend to think of him today.
As he left this country, he joined the Communist Party to go to Ghana.
Yeah.
I think, however, with a book like yours, we'll step back and see him in the fullness of his, how shall I put it, controversy as a person who was so committed to democracy,
Yes.
that he was prepared to be victimized by it.
He was.
I think that will have to be our last question.
Yeah.
And so my thanks to the Leon Levy Center and to Shelby White for her generous support. And thank you so much, Chad, for this wonderful book. And I will bid us good night.
Thank you, David, so much. And thank you, everyone, for joining us.